Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Sorry about that. We just switch some plugs around here and get to a better spot.
Don't worry.
Don't worry, absolutely. How are you today?
Doing very well, thank you. Jumping in on this.
Don't worry.
All right, I'm moving us upstairs. Come for a walk. How are you all doing? I'm going to take you into my drawing studio.
Ooh,
Yeah, I want to
amazing.
give you a little tour.
The Batcave.
The signal will remain. Okay, I'm going to switch. When we do the conversation, I'll switch over, but I just wanted to show you the drawing space.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
There we go.
Oh, perfect.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Can hear
Okay,
you now.
I'll put a light on here. Here we go. Greetings, all. Sorry you couldn't hear me there for a moment.
Don't
worry,
worry.
don't worry.
Thank you.
Don't worry,
Thank
don't
you so
worry.
much.
Okay, you are now in my viewing room. This is my DVD and video collection. It's
Ooh,
also the best
beautiful.
spot for me to do this where I won't be driving my wife crazy. She heard all these stories before. Okay, I am yours. And again, I apologize.
Don't worry. Thank you
No,
so
don't worry,
much
don't worry.
for being here, for dedicating to us this time. My name is Francesco.
Hello.
I am Davide.
Hello.
And my name is Max. Thank you for having us.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me. I very much appreciate it.
Yes.
Okay. I am available to you. So you folks have questions, I'm sure. I can talk about anything that's of interest to you. So
Anything. To food, to comics, everything.
Everything.
And okay, I began. This question is when better. Where did you learn to draw, and when did you realize that this talent you got could become a job?
okay, that's a two-part question. I'll begin by saying, I mean, I'm talking to you from my home in Vermont, which is my home state. So Vermont, if you don't know much about it, is in New England. We're situated bordering New York State on the east, on the west, New Hampshire on the east, Canada just north of us. And the reason I wanted you to understand where I live is being born in 1955, my wanting to draw comics made no sense to any adult in my world whatsoever. I might as well have said, you know, I'm going to breathe Plutane, you know, I'm going to breathe butane gas on Pluto. That made about as much sense as saying, I want to draw for a living to my parents, to my relatives, to any adult. The urge to draw came really early, in part because, you know, winters are long in Vermont. I don't like below zero weather, even though I, like all kids, enjoyed playing outside growing up. I had a lot of free time indoors, and I was really captivated by the idea of all these things that were not in the world around me. Like almost all kids, I from a very young age was fascinated with dinosaurs. And I knew that dinosaurs weren't alive anymore, but I also knew they had once been alive. And that is what sparked me to draw. I began drawing dinosaurs. And sometime around the age of 3 or 4, you know, like all kids, when I was drawing, it looked like something to me, but it never looked like anything to anybody who looked at the marks I made on paper. Sometime around when I was 3 or 4, I drew a dinosaur, and my father looked over my shoulder and said, "Oh, Stevie drew a dinosaur." And that's like when the light bulb went off, because that's when I realized, oh, he recognized it. Like what I saw in my head and tried to put on paper, my father recognized. And that was like the magic moment. That's when the addiction kicked in. That's when I had to keep drawing. The point where it became a real calling for me, and specifically not just drawing, but comics. A lot of people think that if you love drawing, you love doing comics. That's not true. And a lot of people think that people who love comics love drawing, and that's not true either. Comics is this amazing synthesis of various skill sets that when you combine them, tell stories in really unique and very personal and intimate ways. And the point when comics became important to me is shortly after my family had moved to a very tiny town called Duxbury, Vermont. And that's spelled D-U-X-B-U-R-Y. It's not like Duckburg, you know, Karl Barth. But it's about that small, or smaller. And my next door neighbor, I became very close friends with my next door neighbor, who was older than me by 1.5 years or 2 years. His name was Mitch Casey. And Mitch folded 2 sheets of paper and folded them together and stapled them and began drawing. And he drew a comic called Attack of the Giant Tsetse Flies. And that's when I realized that these comic books that I had grown up with, that my older brother had, that our neighbors had, that Mitch and I loved, that people drew them. I don't think I had ever quite, you know, grasped that people did this work. But when I saw Mitch draw Attack of the Giant Tsetse Flies, that's when I understood. People do this. Mitch can do this. I can do this. And Mitch and I began drawing our own comics. And I'm telling you about Mitch Casey and Attack of the Giant Tsetse Flies because I think that was the point where I realized this could be a job. Okay. Mitch and I would draw our own little monster magazines and we would sell them to our classmates at school. Hey, you know, that's entrepreneurship. So unfortunately, we didn't have photocopiers. So once we sold our, you know, new issue of Big Monsters, that was the only copy we had. It was gone. It wasn't until later in life that I began to understand, oh, I need access to the Mimeo machine or later on photocopying and so on. But it was still a fantastic dream. You know, it still made no sense to any of the adults in my world. My parents were supportive in their way. You know, my dad would bring home paper. My mom always seemed to make sure we had tablets and so on. We all had comic books. Comic books were everywhere when I was a kid growing up. But it didn't really become a job for me until I had to make the decision about where I was going to go to college after I graduated high school in 1973. And it really, by then, underground comics were available to me. And underground comics were also important because they tore the blinders off, right? Like all American kids in the 50s and 60s, I grew up with 4-color newsstand comics published by Dell Comics and DC Comics and Marvel Comics later on. Yeah. But underground comics, which I first saw in 1969 or 1970, that's when I realized, that's when the blinders were torn off. And I realized that anything I could imagine, if I had the skill and could put it down on paper, anyone could read it. So it was that combination, which were a decade or so apart, of seeing Mitch Casey draw his own comic when we were kids. And once I was graduated from high school, realizing that underground comics were something I could pursue. And that's when it became really a calling. That's when that's when I said no to taking over the family business, which was a grocery store in Colbyville, Vermont. That's when I said no to certain, college paths I could have taken in order to pursue cartooning. And it was just dumb luck and good fortune that the very year I had to make some major life decisions, Joe Kubert announced he was opening this new cartooning school, the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art. And I got accepted as a member of the first ever class.
Wow.
Then it was a job.
Also. But talking about a dinosaur, I have just a curiosity. What was your reaction the first time that you have seen Jurassic Park?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm a film scholar. I've been as dedicated, or perhaps even more dedicated, to cinema than I have been to comics all my life. And I explain that to you in advance because understand that I grew up watching, monster movies, science fiction movies on television as a kid. And once I was old enough to have a driver's license, I was at the drive-ins and the movie theaters 2, 3, 4 times a week. I explain all this to you in advance to your question about Jurassic Park because I have like 3 or 4 heroes in my life. Heroes meaning people whose body of work inspired me. And one of them is the late, great Ray Harryhausen, the man who did the special effects for films like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Jason and the Argonauts, The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, 1 Million Years BC, and so on. So I grew up loving stop motion animation. I bought every magazine or book I could find about stop motion animation. Later in life, when I was doing Swamp Thing in the 1980s, I got invited twice, 2 or 3 times. I got invited to go to England, and I got to go meet Ray Harryhausen in his home in London and visit with him for an hour. And all of this is before Jurassic Park, long before Jurassic Park. Now, one of the films that I grew up with, actually owning, I was one of those strange kids that had an 8mm projector and would buy, movies. And that's when you could only really buy silent films for 8mm. But one of the films I owned was The Lost World, the 1925 The Lost World, the silent dinosaur film that in many ways is the ground zero of all dinosaur movies. And I always wondered, what was it like for an audience in 1925 to pay their money, go into a theater, watch The Lost World, and at that moment in The Lost World, when they see their first flying dinosaur, what was that like for people in 1925? Well, that's what seeing Jurassic Park for the first time was like. I got to go to a sneak preview because at that time I was working in the video industry here in America, and I wasn't working on the creative end. I was a retailer. I was a shareholder and a buyer and a manager for a video superstore, which is a large rental store. And we got tickets to a sneak preview of Jurassic Park, and that shot in Jurassic Park of the brachiosaur, the first glimpse you get of those beautiful computer generated dinosaurs, that was magical. And that was when I understood, oh, this is what it felt like in 1925. Because when Jurassic Park first came out, that was cutting edge special effects. That looked alive to us. Those dinosaurs looked like living, breathing animals. And much as I loved and still love Ray Harryhausen's work, the connection I felt to it was knowing that it was a form of puppetry, knowing that these were special effects, that these were something that somebody had created. And that first experience of Jurassic Park sort of transcended that. They felt like living creatures you were looking at. It's funny because it's only on the first viewing that it did that. I'm a movie junkie, so I immediately went back the next weekend when the film opened officially. And as soon as you have experienced something like that once, when you go back, you begin to recognize all the artifacts, right? I could recognize, oh, that's the Stan Winston live action model, that's the CGI, you know, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's when intellectually you're beginning to recognize, you know, what the components are and how it's put together. It's funny because a couple of years after Jurassic Park, I got to interview Phil Tippett, who was the special effects creator, who was part of the team with Dennis Muren and all the other creators on Jurassic Park. And Phil Tippett said to me that the longer that CGI is around, the quicker audiences will come to recognize the artifacts, the artifice, the artificiality of it. And he was right. You know, within 2 years, you'd see a TV commercial and you could instantly recognize computer effects as being computer effects. Like our eyes and our mind almost instantly adjusted to this new paradigm. Yeah. So there was nothing quite like seeing Jurassic Park that first night, that first time. I remember coming out with the friends I saw it with, and they were kind of arguing about whether they would let their kids see it. And at the time, you know, my kids were young, and I said, "Are you kidding? I mean, I'm taking my kids to this like immediately." And they were like, "Oh, I don't know. This is pretty scary." And to me, I don't know, you know, to me, those are the movies I loved when I was a kid. I wasn't going to deny my kids going to see that, but that's how vivid it was that when it was new, you know, that people found that the film put them emotionally at the bottom of the food chain. And that was a very scary thought for adults. And they thought kids couldn't handle it. And my thought was, God, when you're a kid, you know you're at the bottom of the food chain. Like there's no revelation here. Kids already know they're at the bottom of the food chain. So I hope that answered the question. It was kind of a long answer, but I needed you to understand what it looked like to me that first time.
Thank you.
Well, if I can continue on the same, you know, vein of David's question, I wanted to ask you, what are your inspirations in cinema, like in old movies and even maybe in today's panorama? Which are the artists that you know you look with interest and that you loved from the past?
Okay, and this is not me trying to brown nose you fellows, as we say here in America. You know, the filmmakers are first, the directors who first moved me were Italian directors. I grew up with the films of Mario Bava. I saw La Maschera del Demonio, which was called Black Sunday here in America.
Yeah.
I saw that when I was quite young, probably too young to have seen it. And that was the scariest thing I had ever seen in my life at that point. And I loved it. I adored it. I wanted more. And what I wanted was to see the world the way Mario Bava made me see the world. I understand there are other filmmakers whose work I love, you know, Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick, Federico Fellini, you know, Antonioni. There's all these filmmakers whose work I love, but nobody made the connection with me as a viewer the way Mario Bava's films did, until I was 12 years old and Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars played in American theaters. And it was funny, I don't know how those films played in Italy. I've read about how they were received, and the first one didn't do well initially. And we had the same credits you had, where they had fake American names on them so that, you know, everyone thought they were made by Americans. But here in America, all three of the Leone Westerns, A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, United Artists held on to those, and they released them all the same year. They all came out in 1967. So it was like, we got to see A Fistful of Dollars, and then a few months later, we got to see for a few dollars more. And then at the end of that summer, the beginning of that fall, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly came out. And that was like, oh my God, it was like taking a drug. It was like, oh, how do I see more movies that are like this? And for me, it wasn't just the excitement of the story, even though I got caught up in those stories, and it wasn't just the characters, even though I got caught up with those characters. It was like Mario Bava's films, where it altered how I saw the world. It altered how I perceived reality. And just as Mario Bava taught me shadow and light and how color and light work, Leone taught me about time and space. You know, I had never experienced any form of storytelling where stretching out, you know, these moments so that something that an American film would have happened in 2 minutes was like 15 minutes of screen time, and you got caught up in it with these emotions that you had never felt before. That was really intoxicating to me. So those were my two favorite filmmakers growing up, were Mario Bava and Sergio Leone. And then the third filmmaker who really impacted my work in a way that you would have experienced reading, you know, my collaborations with Alan Moore and John Totleben and Rick Veitch on Swamp Thing, was a British director named Nicholas Roeg. And in 1970, a film that Nicholas Roeg co-directed, his first film as a director, called Performance. It stars Mick Jagger and James Fox. It's like an underground movie, only Warner Brothers released it, and it was in mainstream movie theaters instead of something I saw on a college campus. And Nicholas Roeg, my favorites of his films are his earliest films: Performance, Walkabout, Don't Look Now, which is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Roeg had this way of telling stories where he approaches storytelling almost like mosaic. And he's telling you the story from the outside in. It's not linear storytelling. It's storytelling driven by the emotions. And the emotional high point of the story might be, in terms of the linear narrative, in the middle of the story. And he'll edit his films in such a way that at the moment when the characters are making connections, you're making those same connections. And it makes the film sort of detonate in your head instead of something you just watch. And you can see it, the way it impacted my work and the way it impacted Alan Moore's work, if you read our first collaborative issue of Swamp Thing we did, the anatomy lesson, Saga of the Swamp Thing number 21. The story that begins and ends with Jason Woodrue in Washington, D.C. looking out the windows. And at the end, it's him as the Floronic Man looking out the windows. That little 22-page issue, that chapter, is structured like a Nicholas Roeg film. And Alan and I, in our first exchange of letters, and we were exchanging massive letters. We did all that work before there was the internet, you know, before we could talk on a phone like all of us are right now. We were doing everything through the mail. And in the first exchange of letters, both Alan and I, you know, let the other know, hey, I really love Nicholas Roeg's films. And that became sort of a touchstone for us. So those were my three, like the holy trinity of cinema to me, were Mario Bava, Sergio Leone, and Nicholas Roeg. There are countless other films and filmmakers I love, and we can go on and on about that if you wish. But those are the three that really made me want to tell stories and shaped my approach to my storytelling and to my artwork as well. And I don't know how clearly you would see that in my work. You know, I've only done one Western in my whole life as a cartoonist. And I did that as, no, I've done two. I did one with, that I scripted that was drawn by the great Alex Nino. And it's sort of a sequel to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's about Tuco, the character of Tuco that Eli Wallach plays. And the other Western I did was for a little British anthology that came out, I think about 10 years ago. But it's not that I've done Westerns, because I haven't, but the way I approach setting up a scene, drawing a scene, the way I want you as a reader to see what's going on. There's a lot of Sergio Leone in my work. There's a lot of Mario Bava in my work. There's a lot of Nicholas Roeg in my work. I just don't know how visible that would be to anybody. When you're an artist, you don't worry about that. Whatever influences you, and whatever comes out of you, comes out of you. And that's how it works.
See, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And to stay in comics adventure.
Yes.
Let's talk about Swamp Thing. How
Okay.
did you end up to drawing Swamp Thing?
When I went to the Joe Kubert School, it was a small class. It was a 2-year program when I went to the Kubert School. There were 21 of us, right, who were members of that first class. And some of our classmates weren't able to come back the second year. I think there were 17 of us that were there the second year. But those friendships that were formed, many of them have lasted a lifetime. I'm 66 now, and I'm still very close friends with the people I met for the first time at the Kubert School. Among my classmates, I mean, most people know that Rick Veitch and I went to the Kubert School, and that was the beginning of our friendship. And Rick and I have worked together off and on in different projects over the year. But one of our classmates was Tom Yates. Tom Yates is still active in comics. I don't know if it's available in newspapers in where you live, but he is the artist on Prince Valiant right now. Okay, Tom Yates is the man drawing the Hal Foster as the creator of Prince Valiant. Tom Yates is the one drawing the strip right now. So when we graduated from the Kubert School, that would have been spring of 1978. I knew if I moved back to Vermont, I might not get my foot in the door as a cartoonist, right? At that time, the hub of the American comic book industry was still New York City. Marvel Comics was in New York City. Yep. DC Comics was in New York City. Archie Comics was in New York City. And more important to me, Heavy Metal was in New York City. Heavy Metal had just started publishing the year before I graduated. In fact, I was one of the first Americans to sell new work to Heavy Metal because they were primarily reprinting work from the Franco-Belgian Humanoids Associates, Metal Hurlant, and so on. So when we graduated, I knew if I moved back to Vermont, I might not work in comics. You know, I'd be too far away from New York. And the same was true of 3 of my classmates. John Tottleben, who is from Pennsylvania. Tom Yates, who was born and raised in California, and Tom lives in California now. And Rick Veitch, who was also from Vermont, my home state. So we decided to rent a house together. None of us could afford much in the way of rent, but if 4 of us went in and co-rented a place, and we were in walking distance still of the school, and Joe Kubert had started a business called Telegraphics, and we would work for Joe. You know, we drew comic books for various companies. You know, Sparky the Fire Dog to promote fire safety and those kind of industrial comics, if you will. So Tom Yates was one of our house buddies. And the way we all survived is if one of us got a job, we would try to get the foot in the door for our friends as well. We didn't see each other as competitors. We felt like we were the same tribe and we were going to take care of each other. Some months, you know, some months I would have work and Tom Yates and Rick Veitch wouldn't have work. So I would pay a larger share of the rent. Other months I would be broke because I hadn't gotten any paying work. And somebody else who had just gotten work would cover that. So it was a very communal, it was almost like a hippie commune in a way. This meant that as we continued in the comic book field, into the 1980s, if one of us got a job with a new publisher, we would put our friends in touch with that publisher. We kept this kind of collaborative relationship going. So when Tom Yates got the job to draw Swamp Thing, when DC Comics revived the Swamp Thing comic in 1980-81, Tom stayed with the comic for about 15 issues, 14 or 15 issues. He let us know when he was going to leave. And we had been helping Tom all along. And when I say we, starting with Swamp Thing #2, not the original Swamp Thing that Bernie Wrightson and Len Wein did, the new series, Saga of the Swamp Thing, that Marty Pasco wrote, and Len Wein was our editor. The original writer of Swamp Thing was our editor. Right from the second issue, John Tottleben was assisting Tom Yates, right? Tom was responsible for all the pencils and all the inks on every issue. And that's deadline after deadline after deadline. It never stops, right? And in one way, it's what you've been working for all your life when you want to be a cartoonist, but it's also kind of a curse, because once you get what you want, you sort of give up your life. You don't have time to do anything else because you just have to be at the drawing board. So starting with the second issue, John Tottleben would take the bus from Erie, Pennsylvania to Hopatcong, New Jersey, where Tom Yates lived at that time, and stay with Tom for a couple of days, 3-4 days, and help him on pages and then go home. Rick Veitch was shuttling between Vermont, where his wife and his child, Ezra, lived, and keeping his room in our house in New Jersey. And whenever Rick was in New Jersey, he would drive down and help Tom. And starting with #8 of Tom's run on Swamp Thing, I did the layouts for some of the issues, meaning Tom gave me the script, and it was my job to take the script and break it down page by page, panel by panel, in very loose, roughly penciled form, and then give it to Tom, and he would do the finished art. So if you look at Swamp Thing #8 by Marty Pasco and Tom Yates, on the splash page, there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and if you turn the page upside down, Tom like snuck under the tail, it says layouts, SRB, and that's me, SR Bissette. So we were helping Tom. We had been helping Tom, the three of us, all through his run. So he let John Tottleben and I know, guys, Tom's first love is adventure. He loves adventure comics. The cartoonists whose work he loved that made him want to draw were Alex Raymond, Hal Foster, Al Williams. Oh, he's not a monster guy. And that's part of why he said to John Tottleben and I, I'm going to leave, because he knew that John Tottleben and I, we are monster guys. We are horror guys, right? We live for that shit. And it's funny because, you know, Tom's dream was to draw comics that featured Tarzan and Zorro and Prince Valiant. And he's gotten to do all that. Tom Yates has done Tarzan comics. He did Zorro, the comic strip, with Don McGregor writing, and now he's doing Prince Valiant. So, you know, Tom's dreams have come true. We got a call from another Hubert School classmate, Tim Truman, who you may know Tim Truman's work from, he did Scout, and he did Jonah Hex with Joe Lansdale writing, and Tim Truman did the pencils and Sam Glansman did the inks. So Tim Truman was one of our classmates. And Tim was working at the time for TSR, which is the company that makes the Dungeon and Dragon games. And he said, guys, they have commissioned me to design a toy line, and I want you guys to come out. I'll pay you for a week's work. We'll put you up in a hotel, and we'll rent a separate hotel room, and that'll be our sweatshop. That's where we'll set up the drawing boards, and we'll all work on designing the toys. So John Tottleben, Rick Veitch, and myself were on that team that Tim Truman put together. So during the day for 8 hours, we were drawing all the Dungeon and Dragon characters, you know, and designing them as toys, meaning we had to draw them from 4 or 5 different, you know, we would have to do a turnaround character sheet and a close-up of the head and so on. And then at night, John Tollivan and I would go back to one of our 2 rooms, and we worked up some sample pages of Swamp Thing. We did one set of sample pages where John penciled and I inked, and we did another set of story pages where I penciled and John Tollivan inked. Now, I was the more experienced visual storyteller at that time. John's a bit younger than me, and this would have been 1982. And by then, I had been working professionally. I mean, my first comic, which I self-published with friends before I got to the Kubert School, was in 1976. So I had been working and doing comics by that time, you know, for 8 years, 7 or 8 years. John was an incredible painter and illustrator, but he hadn't done that much comics work yet. So Len Wein looked at our sample pages and he went, right, Bissette, you're the better storyteller, you're the penciler. John, you've got the better line style, your inks are beautiful, you're the inker. And that's how we got the job. We only later found out that we were, you know, we were one of many artists who were trying out for the book. And I don't know if we were competing with them, but I later was shown sample pages by Dave Gibbons of Swamp Thing. And I was also later found sample drawings by Art Soydam, who was trying out for Swamp Thing. He had kind of an interesting Swamp Thing. He looked like a frog. He sort of had frog eyes. But we got the gig, and we started on the book with issue number 16. And we were still working with Marty Pasco as the writer. And Alan Moore came on board with issue 20 and 21. So that's the long story. That's how we got the gig.
Thank you. It's incredible.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Okay. Is there a superhero you would like to draw a story?
That's an interesting question. Is it David?
Yes, David.
Okay. I do not take this personally. I hate superheroes. I hate superheroes. I hate them so much that when Alan Moore started to put them in the scripts on Swamp Thing, my reaction was very negative. I was like, oh God, why are we fucking this up by bringing the Justice League in, right? And I guess my reaction was so outspoken that Len Wein and Alan Moore agreed that they would tell me that Len Wein made Alan put superheroes in the script. They didn't want me to know that it was Alan's idea. I found out. It was clear. But so, you know, my idea of a superhero, Dave, that I like to draw, in fact, I love to draw this character to this day, is Jack Kirby's The Demon, Etrigan, right? I love drawing Etrigan. I still draw Etrigan all the time. It's not my character, right? It's one of Jack Kirby's characters from the 1970s, but I love drawing Etrigan. Now, that's not really a superhero, I know. I mean, he's a demon from hell, right? And in a lot of ways, my problems with a character like the demon, here's the example I can give you, David. When John Tollivan and I were drawing the annual, the first Swamp Thing annual, which is that long story called Down Amongst the Dead Man, where Swamp Thing has to go to hell to rescue his sweetheart, Abby. The idea was that Alan would put all the DC supernatural characters in that story. So we got to draw the Phantom Stranger. We got to draw Dead Man. We got to draw the Spectre. We had already done the Demon. In fact, that 3-part Demon story was one of the plot suggestions that John Tollivan and I had originally pitched to Marty Pasco. But it was also one of the story ideas that Alan Moore liked and worked with. So we had already drawn the Demon. And so when we were drawing that issue, we discovered something very funny about DC supernatural characters. They don't have any eyeballs. None of them have eyeballs. Okay. Number two, most of them wear little pointed booties. Okay. The demon and dead man both wear like little pointed booties, like a circus acrobat would wear or something. Also, they're very brightly colored, right? Dead man is red and white, and the demon, much as I love the character, he's the color of a stop sign and a yield sign. He's red and yellow. Like, these are not scary colors, right? These do not inspire fear in the heart. And because we have to draw all these characters in one story, these similarities between them suddenly became a problem. Like, John and I were on the phone and we're like, well, we can't keep having characters with no eyeballs, right? So I came up with the idea of drawing the Phantom Stranger with like dead eyes, right? Oh, and the Spectre also wears little pointed booties, Dave. So I, and also there were a lot of similarities, like both the Spectre and Dead Man, they kind of look like Boris Karloff, the Mummy, with the wrinkly white skin. There's not a lot of imagination to the physical attributes of those characters. And it was our job to make them all look very individualistic and quite unique from one another. So we had to come up with different ways of doing that. Now, there's an old Golden Age cartoonist named Vincent Fago, F-A-G-O. You may or may not have heard of him. If he was known at all here in America, he was known for, he did a kid's comic strip called Peter Rabbit, about the little bunnies. And Vincent Fago also packaged this series of classics illustrated that were all beautifully drawn by Filipino cartoonists like Alex Nino and Alfredo Alcala and that generation of cartoonists in the 70s. Vincent Fago once looked at my art portfolio. I got to visit his house one night. He lived in Vermont, just a short ways from where I live now. And I was invited to dinner. And this is when I was a student at the Kubert School. And Vincent looked at my portfolio and he said, you have a hard time keeping your characters look consistent panel to panel. Like, you need to work on this. This is a weakness you have. And over dinner, we had been chatting and he had asked what I liked and we got talking about movies, and Vincent, loved the older films with Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn and everything. And when he was giving me this advice, he said, you love movies, Steve. Here's what you need to do to keep your characters consistent. Base your characters on actors or performers where you can get a lot of photo reference until you get the hang of drawing them as themselves. And that was what I was doing in the 1980s when I was working on Swamp Thing, okay? If you look back at those Swamp Thing issues, Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, is played by Peter Cushing, the Dr. Frankenstein from the Hammer films, okay? Abby, our heroine, she's based on Sigourney Weaver, okay? Alien had just come out in 1979. She had a really interesting facial structure, those cheekbones and that strong physique. She was my Abby. And when John Tollivan was inking the characters, he would soften that a bit. Like, Abby looked more like herself once John had inked her. And it took me probably 4 issues before I didn't need photo reference anymore. I could draw our Abby freehand. So why am I telling you all this? You asked me about superheroes. So when we were drawing all these superheroes, I cast them, okay? Dead Man is Boris Karloff. The Phantom Stranger is Lee Van Cleef from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and For a Few Dollars More. And it was funny because Len Wein argued with me when I turned in the pencils. Like, I gave the Phantom Stranger these dead eyeballs, and I drew them with little lines so that when John inked them, they would be gray. And Len Wein made John Tollivan erase that. He said, no, Phantom Stranger has blank eyes. And John and I argued, but Len Wein's our boss. You don't argue with your boss for too long. He's the boss. And we also knew the way things worked at DC. I mean, if we put that in, Len, once he got our pages, would go to the art department and say, white out the eyeballs. So, So, you know, to answer your question again, the Demon is the one character of all the superheroes in comics that if I had a chance to go back to superheroes, that's the character I would love to draw. Other than the Demon, the only character I had fun drawing when we were doing those Swamp Thing issues was Hawkman. And I guess it's because of the bird aspect, you know, like if you're familiar with my work, you know I'm a dinosaur junkie. So maybe it's that bird thing, you know. But I think it's also when I was a kid growing up, the only superhero comic I really liked was Joe Kubert's Hawkman, because the way Joe drew Hawkman and Hawkgirl looked really cool. You know, it didn't make sense anatomically, you know, like where are their eyes when they have that big headpiece on, like where are their eyes, how do they see out of that thing? And Joe made it look believable. And but that's an aspect of superheroes that I struggle with. When we were drawing those issues of Swamp Thing, there were certain characters. God, who was it? There was a character called Firestorm. Are you familiar with the character of Firestorm? And John and I, like when I turned in my first pages and I was like, yeah, where's his brain? I mean, he's like a human Bic lighter, cigarette lighter. Like, where's his brain? How does that work? When I was a real little kid, I could believe in King Kong. Like a 50-foot giant gorilla loose in New York, no problem. I can believe in that. Batman, that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. A guy dressing up like a bat to go out and fight crime, like that made no sense to me. That said, you know, there are superhero comics I love, but I am not, you know, enamored with this current wave of superhero movies. I go to see them all in part because I was teaching at a cartooning school for 15 years. So I had to go see all the movies that the students would be talking about, right? But I am not in love with the superhero movies. I find that all the absurdities that were ridiculous to me in the comics look even more absurd to me when they're up on the big screen. And it doesn't solve the problem for me when I'm watching a superhero movie that if instead of one superhero, you put 25 superheroes in it, that just makes it even stupider to me. So there are all my biases, and please forgive me, Dave.
Don't worry, let me just cover my Superman shield. Well, let me ask something similar, but not about the usual superheroes. Something about one of the most interesting superheroes to me, Swamp Thing. Did you watch the Swamp Thing show that came out a few years ago? And
oh yes,
what did you think about it? Did you like it? And
you know, I've seen all the Swamp Thing everythings, right? Yeah. Because I love horror and monster movies, I got to see the Wes Craven Swamp Thing in a movie theater when it came out back in 1981. It barely played here in America. I don't know if it played much in Italy. Yeah. I mean, it barely
never arrived. Never arrived.
I saw the Swamp Thing cartoon show.
Mm-hmm.
I still have it on VHS in my collection. I saw the Swamp Thing TV show that came out, about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. There was a TV series.
Yes.
Here in America, it was a cable series. And I saw the new series that they made I think that they shot that about 2 years ago, is the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I should also mention to all of you, John Totleben and his wife, Michelle Totleben, actually visited the set for the Swamp Thing show. The TV people didn't invite them on. Michelle and John were going to visit a longtime friend of theirs who lives in North Carolina. And Michelle, God bless her, without telling John, made a number of phone calls and figured out how to get them on the set for a couple of hours. And once they got there, apparently the people at the production were very accommodating. I should also, full disclosure, I have been a longtime acquaintance. We're not close friends, but we stay in touch with Mark Verheiden. Mark Verheiden is the man who wrote the Aliens comic book series that Mark Nelson drew. And I met Mark Verheiden through Mark Nelson. I'm very good friends with Mark Nelson, the cartoonist who did the Dark Horse Alien series. So I I was interested in seeing what they were going to do because Mark Verheiden was the story producer on the new series. So, and I also felt like, okay, Mark Verheiden knows what we did. And what's even more interesting than my reaction is my wife, who hates monster movies and hates even more horror movies, decided, oh yeah, I'll watch the Swamp Thing series with you. And we both enjoyed it. There were things that didn't make sense to either of us. Like I don't know why they brought the Blue Devil into it. You know, the whole character of the Blue Devil.
Yeah.
That was a comic that was new when I was doing Swamp Thing. Paris Cullins was the co-creator on Blue Devil. And it was a fun comic book when it came out in the 80s, but it's not a character I would have connected. I have no idea how DC and Marvel in their latest corporate incarnations, why they decide to do what they do with their characters. But I did like how they handled the whole Jason Woodrue thing. I really loved not just the look of Swamp Thing, but the fact that he was so primal right from the start. You know, they had him killing people, which is something they never would have done on the earlier series. It had a very strong atmosphere that I liked. You could tell it had actually been shot in real locations.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how you got to see it in your country, but I don't watch things on cable. I wait until they're on DVD or Blu-ray. So we watched it when we were able to get DVDs that friends had burned. So we got to see the uncensored version. Here in America now, they're rerunning Swamp Thing, and they've removed a lot of
on the CW, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but we saw the original, you know, the uncut version, and it was quite good. What was disappointing to me is that well, not only that they pulled the plug on the series, that was disappointing, but also that they finally get to the Floronic Man, and we only see him in that little bit after the final credits of the final episode. Like the show's over and we finally get to see the Floronic Man. That's the series I want to see, because the Floronic Man was a great character to work on when we were doing the comics, and he was a lot of fun to draw, and I would love to see what they were planning, but we'll never know now. We'll never know.
Yeah, I ask you that because me and my friends really loved the show, the atmosphere, as you were talking, and yeah, they would have killed me if I didn't ask you this question.
I'll also add for your friends, I also got to see the Constantine series, which here in America was broadcast on NBC, one of the big three, well, used to be the big three networks, now they're fringe. And I enjoyed the Constantine series too. What was funny though about John Constantine in the TV series is because they did it for NBC, network television doesn't allow their characters to smoke cigarettes anymore. And part of the fun for me of watching the Constantine series was, how are they going to sneak in that he smokes cigarettes, right? They couldn't show him smoking cigarettes. So they would have him like stubbing it out in an ashtray, or that week's adventure would be over and he would lean against the car and you could see he was bringing something up to his mouth and they cut away. But I thought the Constantine series was also had a good atmosphere. You know, both of the series tried to be, they tried to honor the comics that they were working from. And even though they didn't adapt our work, per se. I mean, there were elements of our work that appeared in the series, but it's not an adaptation of the Alan Moore, Totleben, Veitch, Bissette, Swamp Thing, but the touchstones were there. And I also liked the original elements that they wove in, you know, the whole thing with the cop and her son, and, you know, that was okay. That was interesting. I didn't quite get the Blue Devil thing, didn't quite mesh for me.
Yeah.
Also, I thought they're sort of offhand, you know, folding in the Phantom Stranger as that kind of dumpy, overweight guy that wandered in. You know now, you know, who I had in my head was Lee Van Cleef, and that guy was all like Lee Van Cleef. But those, I'm critical of a lot of these series and movies that are comic related, because if my wife watches them, she's a normal person, right? I'm not a normal person, and I don't know you guys, but the fact you even wanted to talk to me speaks volumes, right? you know, we come to these movies and these TV shows with all this, you know, arcane knowledge that we have of the characters, or things that baggage we carry about the characters. And there's a lot of story elements they weave into the series like Swamp Thing that just didn't make sense to a casual viewer. My wife didn't know who the Phantom Stranger was. So all that cutesy stuff with this character just didn't really read for her. And especially the stuff with the Blue Devil. She was like, why is that even part of this story? It's not that the character didn't interest her. It wasn't that, you know, the fact he couldn't leave the town and there was obviously some sort of a barrier that he couldn't drive beyond. You know, she got that. That was kind of an interesting subplot, but it didn't have anything to do with the elements of the series that she, as a regular viewer, found interesting. And I feel like that kind of clutter is one of the problems I have with a lot of the current big media adaptations from comics. You know, it doesn't make something better to throw the Falcon into it. You know, the last Marvel movie that Marge saw and enjoyed was Ant-Man. But as soon as they did the little Captain America insert with the Falcon at the Avengers headquarters, like, that didn't mean anything to her. It knocked her out of the movie for 10 minutes. And then they shift gears right back to the Ant-Man story. So it's like, you know, I don't think these movies are going to stand the test of time. I'll use a reference point for all of you that touches on to something I mentioned earlier. You don't have to have seen A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More to have The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly work for you. If you have seen all those Leone Eastwood Westerns, there's little story grace notes they fold in, you know. He goes to the ruins where that young Confederate soldier is dying, and he lays his jacket over the soldier and he picks up the serape. And if you've seen all the movies, you go, oh, so this is before A Fistful of Dollars, right? But you don't have to know that. The scene still works emotionally, whether you make that connection or not.
Yeah.
So many of this comics influenced media, they're so determined to pull in all this, you know, comic book universe stuff that it disrupts the storytelling, and it renders the story that the audience might be interested in nonsensical at certain points. I'm a storyteller, you know, and we tried to make every issue of Swamp Thing so that if it was the first issue you'd ever read, it would still work for you. You still got a story. You still understood the characters. You still got an emotional hit off of it. You wouldn't make all the connections that the habitual Swamp Thing reader would make. But it was very important to us to understand that every chapter of Swamp Thing we wrote and drew, we knew was somebody's first chapter. And we tried to make it make sense. And the point when I stopped being interested in working on Swamp Thing is when they made us do the Crisis on Infinite Earth crossover issue. Because that was the first issue where the company said, no, you have to do this. And it was also the first issue where I went, well, this isn't going to make any sense to somebody if it's their first Swamp Thing comic. I mean, the comic didn't make much sense to me. And there I was 3 years into the job drawing that issue. So that's, you know, that's my problem. The films, the novels, the short stories, the music that we all, you know, love and go back to again and again in our life, we're able to go back to because it has its own integrity and it works cohesively on its own level. There may be grace notes and there may be story strokes and there may be characters that if we had read all the work by that writer, we'd go, oh, they're in that, you know. Stephen King writes every novel, whether it's set in one of his main towns or not, so that it works as a novel. You don't have to have read everything since Salem's Lot to understand what Castle Rock is and where Maine is. So enough. I've pontificated enough on that.
Thank you for your.
Thank you. Yes, and let's talk about you know, Man-Thing. What the relationship between you?
Oh,
and
you know,
Man.
that's a great question. Right. Now, do you all know the history of Man-Thing and Swamp Thing?
Yeah.
Do you all know that the writers, Len Wein and Gary Conway, were roommates at the time?
No.
I didn't.
So Len Wein and Gary Conway were young comic writers. They were trying to make it in New York City. This would have been, what, 1970, 71. And they were roommates. They were sharing the rent on an apartment, the same way that, you know, Rick Veitch, John Tottleman, Tom Yates, and myself were. So both of them come up with a swamp monster, right? Jerry Conway, Man-Thing, sells it to Marvel Comics. Len Wein, Swamp Thing, sells it to DC. I never understood. I mean, even when I was a teenager, when those two comics first came out, why, you know, aren't these companies going to sue each other? Like, these are close, you know? And they never did. And later it made sense to me because it's like, oh, well, of course, all the editors knew that Len and Gary were roommates. And so, okay, they're very different characters. Swamp Thing is intelligent, sentient, articulate, even though he has to have a lot of dots between every third word. He speaks very slowly. He's a very different character than Man-Thing, Man-Thing is actually closer to the wellspring of the whole swamp monster archetype. The swamp monster archetype, you know, originally goes way, way back to like the Green Man in Ireland and Scotland and Wales and British, the British Isles. And of course, there's mythical and fable beings that we could all discuss that are sort of the roots of Man-Thing and Swamp Thing, if you will. But Man-Thing is actually closer to the 20th century ground zero of the comic book swamp monsters. And that is a great, great, great writer named Theodore Sturgeon. His first short story sale that he sold to a pulp was a story called It. And it's the story of this hunter dies in the woods. And his body is overgrown with mold and lichen and covered with leaves and so on. And some inexplicable life force inhabits the body and it gets up and starts walking around. But it has no intelligence. It has no memory of the hunter who died there. It has no empathy. It just is stumbling around the woods. And this Theodore Sturgeon story is about the sort of blank horror, if you will, of this animate but non-sentient being that's suddenly walking around the forest. So Man-Thing is closer to that. Does that make sense? And there's also another story. I'll find the name of it and I'll message it to you and you can share it with everybody. There's another pulp story that a woman wrote that also involves this sort of non-sentient plant creature that this little girl finds, and she kind of torments it. But she also is attracted to it. Like, she keeps going back to where it is. It's fallen in this gravel pit and she keeps going back to it. And it's this very strange story. And if you want to experience it, they adapted it for television as an episode of Night Gallery. And it's the story called Brenda, Brenda. And it's a pretty good adaptation of the story. So those two pulp stories, Theodore Sturgeon's It and whatever the original story title was that Night Gallery adapted into Brenda, that is the beginning of that kind of plant monster archetype in 20th century pop culture. And back in the golden age, World War II, golden age American comic books, there was a character called the Heap that you've probably heard of, or you may have heard of. And it was a monster character who was, we called them backup stories here in America, right? So there was a comic book called Airboy. So the longest story in every comic book, Airboy, would be the Airboy adventure. And the backup story, the shorter story in the back of every issue, was the Heap. And the Heap was a World War I German flying ace who was shot down. His plane crashes in a swamp, and same scenario. The pilot disappears. Everyone presumes he's dead, but this plant creature climbs out of the swamp, and it's sort of inhabited by the life force of this dead pilot. But like Man-Thing, he doesn't speak. And like Man-Thing, he is semi-intelligent and semi-sentient, but he's not like Swamp Thing, where he can speak and interact with the human characters, one-on-one. So that's the big difference between Man-Thing and Swamp Thing. And of course, Jerry Conway had the whole thing of, those who know fear burn its Man-Thing's touch, And Man-Thing also is this empath. So Man-Thing is attracted to strong emotions, be they positive emotions like love or negative emotions like fear and hate. That's got nothing to do with Swamp Thing. And there was a writer whose work you probably know, Steve Gerber, better known as the creator of Howard the Duck. Steve Gerber wrote a terrific run of Man-Thing in the early to mid 70s. I think they appeared in a Marvel comic called Adventures into Fear. That was the name of it. Meanwhile, Len and Bernie Wrightson co-create Swamp Thing. It appears as a one-shot story in House of Secrets, and they get great response to the story. They got the most letters that editor Joe Orlando ever received on a single story of House of Secrets. That one Swamp Thing story drew. And also, don't laugh, there was actually an American comic book award at that time called the Comic Book Academy Awards. And Swamp Thing won Best Story for that year. So that would have been 1971. And that's why DC decided, let's turn it into a series. And editor Joe Orlando went to Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson and said, okay, guys, you got to make a comic book series of this. And that's how Swamp Thing, took off and became the character that I ended up working on later. I love drawing Man-Thing. If you've never seen it, I'll send you I've done a couple of drawings of like Swamp Thing and Man-Thing just sort of being buddies in the swamp.
Beautiful.
You'll get a laugh out of it. You buddies. But if the company's ever decided to do a crossover, yeah, that would be fun to do. But I'm also at a point in my life where I have no interest in working for either Marvel or DC. They are terrible, terrible corporate companies to work for. DC, less so. Marvel is truly horrific. Marvel's one of the worst companies to work for. And I say that from experience. I worked for Marvel I freelanced for Marvel from 1977 until 1982. So I have worked Marvel method. I know how that works, where the writer gives you an outline and you're given a page count and you go home and you essentially write the story. I mean, you're penciling it. And then they dialogue it. I have worked in that system. Good work can come out of it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but Marvel is a terrible company to work for and with. They do not pay. They pay a flat page rate up front, and they do not pay royalties. It's a bonus system. So basically, if something happens with work you've done, they may deign to send a little money your way. Now with DC Comics, I want you all to know that ever since 1987, John Totleben, Rick Veitch, and I, we get royalty checks every quarter, right? When they reprint our work, we get money.
Today, this year.
We're right to this year, and we don't get creator money for Swamp Thing because we did not create Swamp Thing, right? Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson created Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
When they reprint our work, we earn royalties off those sales, right? And sometimes it's a little check. It's a few $100s sometimes. Sometimes it's a lot of money. When we do get a creator share of Constantine, because John Totleben, Alan Moore, Rick Veitch, and I co-created Constantine in Swamp Thing. And we earn a lot of money for Constantine. We get a share of what the company earns, okay? We get a tiny, tiny percentage, but when they get a lot of money for something, that trickle down can be, a check for $9,000, $10,000 that shows up out of the blue. You don't know it's coming. You don't know how much it's going to be. However, we only get a share of what they get, right? So when DC, which is owned by Warner Brothers, which is now owned by AT&T, and as of last week, Discovery, when they produce a TV series that's by Warner Brothers, we don't get anything because Warner Brothers doesn't pay itself, right? But when they do a video game, we get a lot of money because the video game manufacturers are not owned by Warner Brothers. So we get a share of the money paid by a video game company to have Constantine in a video game. And that's when we earn a fair amount of money, a surprising amount sometimes. With Marvel, nothing. You know, Jim Starlin, when Thanos appeared in the Avengers movies, Jim Starlin, nothing, right? Once he speaks to the press, they might send him a little check.
Yeah.
But it's not a royalty. It's a very different system. It's very different from European copyright law, right?
Yeah.
The two sisters who created Diabolic, right? I mean, they're long dead and gone now, but their estate owns Diabolic. Here in America, you know, most work that American creators do, that work is owned by the companies they did it for. We are fortunate that we worked at DC in the 80s after they instituted the royalty plan. And, you know, DC pays us every quarter, you know, end of March, end of June, you know, break the year into the quarters, we get a surprise. We never know when it's going to be, but the checks arrive. So I'm glad we did all that work for DC.
Well, to go close to the conclusion, because we have already taken so much of your time.
Oh, that's my pleasure. And we can do this another time as well. And I promise I won't forget next time if we do it again.
Don't worry.
I have a question on behalf of one of my best friends, Paul. He is a big lover of Swamp Thing and Constantine. And he loves the esoteric themes of these characters, the whole esoteric background. He studies Bible, he studies a lot of apocryphs text from the Bible, and he loves to find connections in comics. What do you think? What did you bring from yourself about the esoteric aspects of these characters?
You know, when we were doing Swamp Thing right from the start, John Taliban is out of all of us that worked on Swamp Thing, John Taliban's the one that loved the character. When I first met John at the Kubert School, he was a huge Bernie Wrightson fan, and he would draw Swamp Thing all the time in his sketchbooks. Rick Veitch didn't, I didn't. We knew the character, we had read the comics, we liked them, but John Taliban is the one. And John is Christian, and John is very knowledgeable about the Old Testament, New Testament, the various lost books of the Bible, and so on. He is not fanatical. John is not a fundamentalist at all. He's very street savvy, regular guy, but he is smart and he is well read. Right from the start, when Tom Yates got the job to do Swamp Thing, John began conversations with, you know, we would get together, we were sharing a house, you know, we would party with friends. John's usually the one that would start the conversation about, you know, this aspect of Swamp Thing is interesting, and it would get into mythology and folklore and so on. So for us, sparked by those conversations with John Taliban, we very much were aware of the green man archetype and the link to, and this is quite contrary to biblical matters, the link to pagan cultures and pagan religions, right? That Swamp Thing was sort of the 20th century version of these ancient fertility idols, right? These beings linked to nature, and these beings linked to man's relationship to nature in terms of having to grow our food and hoping for, you know, good harvests. And the pagan sacrifices that were made in some cultures, you know, to those kind of beings and deities. John and Rick Veitch, when we were, we were at a party at one of our classmates' houses, and we're all, you know, we smoke pot, we drink beer, we're shooting the shit. And John starts another one of these conversations, and that's where the whole idea of the hallucinogenic potatoes growing off Swamp Thing came from, right? Like John said, yeah, but, you know, Swamp Thing should be like growing these tubers on him, like you could pluck them and eat them. And Rick Veitch, who's an old hippie, said, yeah, and some of them should be like peyote, You know, you would hallucinate from it. And that's where all that came from, right? And this is years before we were working on Swamp Thing. This is, you know, just party talk among stupid stoned cartoonists, you know? You know, there is one of the differences between Man Thing and Swamp Thing is Swamp Thing as a being is a moral being, right? And even after we put him through the change that we did in our early issues with Alan Moore, where we reinvented the character, where he realizes he was never a man, he was always a plant, he still inhabits a moral universe. And the further we got into working on the book, the more Alan Moore articulated that moral universe, incorporating things like the Parliament of Trees, you know, this idea of these elder plant beings. And that has roots in not so much the books of the Bible as it has, you know, that has roots in J.R. Tolkien, you know, that has roots again in a lot of pagan belief systems and so on. I cannot remember the name of the novel. It was a novel that one of our classmates at Kubert School, Art Ravison, had loaned me. I think it was called The Bog Witch, but it was a Scottish or an Irish novel. I've never seen it again. It was a paperback that Art had, and he said, "Oh, Bissette, you should read this." And it was a story about a village, and there's this bog, you know, the moors and the bog. And the bog actually at the end of the novel becomes this sentient force that kind of overwhelms the whole village. This sort of biblical cleansing of the entire village when the bog rises against it. That's the kind of work that informed what we were doing with Swamp Thing, right? Consciously and unconsciously. It's interesting you ask about the Bible reference because you never know when you put something in a comic how people are going to receive it, right? So, and we didn't see the letters, you know, that readers wrote in. It was very rare that either Len Wein or Karen Berger would mention a letter. But when we drew the first part of the 3-part Jason Blood Demon story, it opens with Jason Blood arrives on a bus in Houma, Louisiana, and his first stop is at a Christian bookstore. He goes into a Christian bookstore, I'm sorry, an occult bookstore that sells Christian things and also occult things. And we drew my Kubert School roommate, Larry Locke, as the guy behind the counter. And Larry had at that time like a long stringy beard and shoulder length hair. And at that time, I had a haircut like you, David, okay? I was like short hair. Now, you know, now I'm an old hippie. So we drew Larry as the guy behind the counter. And I did the pencils, and John Tolliban also knew Larry intimately. So when he inked it, it looked like Larry. But Tatiana Wood, our colorist, who didn't know Larry, when she colored it, she gave him like reddish brown hair. And Karen mentioned that they started getting letters of people outraged that we had Jesus working behind the counter. Now we didn't intend that at all, but when Karen told us that, we laughed the way you did, like, okay, that's legit. And you just never know how people are going to receive it. Now, once Alan got into his cosmology of hell, then you're getting into a real, you know, biblical universe at that point. And that came from Alan. I mean, I penciled it, John inked it, but that whole concept of hell as it was presented in Down Amongst the Dead Men, that was Alan's creative scheme. That was Alan's creative universe that he was, and a lot of that was pulled not just from the Bible, but also from, you know, Dante's Inferno and Paradise Lost, Milton, and so on. And I would argue that probably Neil Gaiman was the next creator to really open that up further with, once he had Sandman going to hell, Neil very consciously was building on that kind of architecture bedrock that Alan had laid with our collaboration on Swamp Thing, and Neil took it to another whole level. So, you know, in terms of your friends' reference points to culture, I guess the starting point would be that Down Amongst the Dead Men, you know, the annual, that long story that we did with Swamp Thing going to hell. I don't think Jack Kirby was coming from a very, I mean, Jack Kirby was quite well read in the Bible and mythology and legend. But his take on Etrigan and the demon, like a lot of Jack Kirby's work, is so inventive and imaginative that it just seems to be pouring out of Jack's head, you know, right onto the page. Your friend might find some touchstones and some fertile ground there in those 3 issues with Etrigan the demon. But you know, I don't think it really asserted itself until we got to that trip to hell. And even there, Alan was going back to pre-biblical texts as well. I mean, that's Orpheus, you know, that's Hades, that's, you know, the Greek and the Roman myth versions of the afterlife as well. It's all folded in there. So it's part of the beauty of it that Alan, much like Neil, who took it even further, you know, we're making these comics we were doing into these crossroads of multiple religious and mythic and folkloric paths, pulling from multiple cultures, European cultures, Asian cultures, and so on. And it was just this kind of, you know, big monster mash, if you will.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, really.
You're very welcome. I can take a last question from each of you unless we've tuckered you out. I know it's much later where you are. So.
No. If I can ask one last, you know, singer, let's say, are there any artists working today you look forward to working in the comic book industry? Oh
yeah. And bear in mind, I mean, people think I'm being facetious when I say it, but I'm not. I mean, I've been teaching. I just retired from teaching last year. I had been teaching since 2005 at the Center for Cartoon Studies. The best new comics work I read every year were by the students. And I'm serious, right? There's this whole new generation of creators who are coming up. And the work that I saw from them, and some of them have become creators who graduated and now their work's in print. You know, Lucy Knisley is one of our graduates, and Luke Kruger Howard just put out a brand new comic called Goes that I highly recommend, Goes. But let me think. You know, I tend to love the comics that take me places I don't go otherwise, right? So I don't tend to read what most people would consider horror comics, and I don't tend to read comics that look like or read anything like what I do. Okay. So I love Michael Deforge's work. Mm-hmm. His work began appearing, I think, 10, 12 years ago from Koyama Press. And it's completely bizarre alien shit. I mean, it's really out there. One of my favorites of his is a graphic novel called Ant Colony. He does not draw representational human figures. He kind of breaks, the characters are like geometric forms. But I really love his work. And I love it in part because it takes me places nobody else's work takes me. And I don't think like that. And I don't talk like that. And I don't write like that. And I certainly don't draw like that. And that's part of why I love Michael Deforge's work. And his last name is spelled capital D, small e, capital F, O-R-G-E. I really love his work. God, I read so much that I'm going to forget, you know, what I'm digging right now. One of my favorite comics that I read this year, it just came out about 2 weeks ago, is a comic called Goes, G-O-E-S. It's by Luke Kruger Howard, an American cartoonist. The whole premise, the first volume, it's a little squareback book. And the first volume, the long story in the front is called the Men's Hugging Club. And the whole premise, it's a work of science fiction. The whole premise is 40 years in the future, what if men were suddenly comfortable with expressing their emotions to each other and they were kind, right? What if kindness suddenly swept through the culture instead of all the crazy shit that we're seeing? He charts out like the story is composed of 3 to 5 separate narratives of a couple of boys in a schoolyard who are little kids, and the men's hugging club. This guy who has started a place where men can just go and hug each other and be kind and then go back home. You know, it's not a homosexual thing. It's just they're being kind to each other and they're comfortable being kind to each other. And then in the middle of it, he has this fanzine excerpt of an interview, right? And it's like 4 pages of this interview as if you were reading it in some sort of a magazine with this guru who founded the men's kindness movement. And suddenly, this is what rockets the whole thing into science fiction. It's like suddenly you realize, oh, this is a whole philosophical wave that has changed the whole culture and the whole world, right? It's like, and it's just a wonderful comic because it was something I'd never thought of. I mean, I'm kind to people. I try to be kind to everybody, but it put me in a mindset of what would be possible. We have so little in our culture right now that posits something positive about our future instead of another dystopian. We've all, you know, when we get off here, we could all go watch a separate TV show that's brand new about how awful the future is going to be. And here was this amazing comic that just says, no, it could be sweet. You know, we just have to be kind to each other. I'm also a big fan of Charles Burns. Probably no surprise to any of you. Charles Burns's work, I tend to buy it in Europe now. And I because it comes out in Europe before it comes out in America. So I'm buying it in languages I can't read without a dictionary. But I just love the visual narratives and Charles Burns's work. And I don't know, I'm probably disappointing you because I'm not naming any DC or Marvel.
No, absolutely, no.
No.
I still do read comic books, but it tends to be alternative and independent comic books. And the work that tends to stick to my ribs, I've just mentioned 3 of them, you know, is the stuff that's nothing like what I do. If you're interested in my work, I'm also doing a lot of writing these days. This past year, the biggest new work I had in print was as a writer. I wrote a huge book on David Cronenberg's The Brood, his film from 1979. It's a 650-page book. I interviewed all the participants in the film and so on, and that came out last year in England from PS Publications. So it's cheaper for you to buy it than it is for me to buy it. And I also got to collaborate with 4 novelist friends of mine on a work of fiction called Studio of Screams. And that's also in print now, and from the same publisher, PS Publishing in the United Kingdom. And that was a lot of fun. We basically invented a British film studio, and we concocted 4 films that don't exist. We're saying we're made in the 60s and 70s. And my job was to write the framing story, right? And what I did is I invented a movie producer named Lawrence Blythewood. And in telling his story, I ended up writing a 5th horror story. So Studio of Screams is 4 original novellas that are presented as if you're reading a novelization of an old British horror movie. And then the framing device, which I wrote, is in and of itself another horror story.
That's amazing.
So there you go. So also keep your eye on what I do as a writer, because I probably spend more time writing than drawing these days.
Will do, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Hey,
Thank you.
for your time and for inviting me in. You guys are great. And feel free to. I don't think we said anything out of class that's going to be a problem.
You were amazing. So for real.
Hey, thanks for your time.
You so
and again, happy to do it another time. And
Sure.
next time, remind me by email the morning we're doing it, because I'm an old man.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Don't worry.
All right. Love to you all. You take care.
Bye.
You take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a nice day.